The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Chen's penthouse office, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. At 52, he was the picture of success: sharp gray suit, perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and the confident posture of a man who had built a tech empire from scratch. Tech Vision Industries had become a household name, and Alexander was its undisputed king. But today, something felt different. As he stared at the framed photo on his desk, him and his wife Rose at their favorite vineyard in Napa Valley, a familiar emptiness gnawed at his chest. 20 years of marriage, and somehow, the woman who had once been his entire world now felt like a stranger. Rose had been there from the beginning, back when Tech Vision was just 3 programmers working out of a garage. She packed his lunches, edited his pitch decks, and even sold her grandmother's jewelry to help fund their first office space. The media loved their story. The college sweethearts who built a billion-dollar empire together. "Mr. Chen, your 10 o'clock is here," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. "Miss Lin from the marketing department." Olivia Lin walked into his office with the confidence of someone half his age, but twice his current enthusiasm. At 28, she represented everything his life had lost: spontaneity, passion, and an unwavering belief that anything was possible. Her quarterly marketing presentations had become the highlight of his month, though he tried not to dwell on why. "I've been thinking about our global expansion," Olivia began, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "What if we approached it differently? Not just as a business venture, but as a cultural revolution." For the next hour, Alexander found himself completely absorbed in her vision. She spoke with her hands, laughed freely, and challenged his perspectives in ways that made him feel alive again. When she pulled up a chair next to him to show something on her tablet, the supple scent of her perfume made his heart race like it hadn't in years. That evening, as his driver took him home to his perfectly manicured mansion in the hills, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. The house lights were on, and through the window, he could see Rose arranging flowers in the living room, a routine she'd maintained every Thursday for the past decade. He thought about their life together: the charity galas, the board meetings, the silent dinners where they both pretended to be interested in each other's days. Rose had become as predictable as his morning coffee, reliable, familiar, but somehow lacking the spark that had once made his hands shake when he held her. That night, after another quiet dinner where the clink of silverware spoke louder than words, Alexander stood in his home office, staring at the city lights below. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Thanks for your time today. Your insights about the Asian market were invaluable. Looking forward to our next meeting." Something inside him snapped. The careful walls he built around his growing discontent came crashing down. He thought about Olivia's laugh, about the way she looked at him like he was more than just a successful businessman, like he was still capable of surprise and adventure. The next morning, Alexander walked into his lawyer's office before dawn. By noon, divorce papers were being delivered to the house. He couldn't bear to do it in person, couldn't face the look in Rose's eyes when 20 years of partnership crumbled like a house of cards. The media exploded with the news. "Tech Titan trades in for newer model," screamed the tabloid headlines. His board members whispered behind closed doors, and his PR team worked overtime to maintain the company's image. But Alexander felt oddly free, like a man waking from a long dream. He moved into the Four Seasons that evening, ignoring the dozen missed calls from Rose. As he sat at the hotel bar, nursing an expensive scotch, his phone lit up with another message from Olivia. "Heard the news. Are you okay?" His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he replied, "Having dinner at Nobu tomorrow night. Would love your company." In the coming weeks, the tech world watched in fascination as Alexander Chen, the man who had everything, systematically dismantled his perfect life. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. He was generous with the settlement, wanting it over before his resolve could waver. Rose's silence during the meetings hurt more than any anger could have. Each night, as he lay awake in his hotel suite, Alexander told himself he was finally choosing happiness. He was taking control of his life, refusing to settle for comfortable monotony. But in those quiet moments between midnight and dawn, a small voice wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But then Olivia would smile at him across a restaurant table, or challenge his thoughts during a late-night strategy session, and the doubt would fade. She made him feel young again, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with his bank account or company stock. Silicon Valley buzzed with rumors and judgments, but Alexander had spent his career making bold moves that others thought foolish. This was just another calculated risk, another chance to rewrite his story. And as spring turned to summer, he convinced himself that the occasional glimpse of Rose's heartbreak in the society pages was simply the price of his newfound freedom. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that this was only the beginning of a story that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed about love, family, and the true cost of happiness. Life with Olivia was like stepping into a different world. Alexander found himself doing things he never imagined: midnight motorcycle rides along the coast, impromptu trips to Paris just because she'd never seen the Eiffel Tower at sunrise, and dancing until dawn at clubs where nobody cared about his net worth or company stock. "You're different when you're with me," Olivia told him one evening as they sat on their private yacht off the coast of Greece. The Mediterranean breeze played with her hair, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. "It's like you've shed 20 years of corporate armor." She wasn't wrong. Gone were the rigid schedules and predictable routines. Alexander had traded his traditional suits for designer jeans and casual blazers. His board members raised eyebrows at his new style, but the company's profits had never been better. It seemed that happiness made him a more innovative leader. Their romance became front-page news. Every gossip magazine wanted details about the tech billionaire and his young love. Paparazzi followed them everywhere, capturing their stolen kisses at restaurants and their laughter at art galleries. While Rose had always shied away from the spotlight, Olivia embraced it. She handled the media with a natural grace that made even the most skeptical journalists warm to their story. "Let them talk," she'd say, wrapping her arms around his waist as they read another tabloid headline. "They're just jealous of what we have." 6 months after his divorce was finalized, Alexander proposed on a private beach in Maldives. He'd arranged for 1,000 lanterns to float across the water, each one carrying a photo of their moments together. Olivia's yes echoed across the water, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Their wedding was the event of the year. They transformed an entire private island into a fairy tale setting, with crystal chandeliers hanging from palm trees and pathways lined with rare orchids. 300 guests flew in on private jets, and a famous pop star performed their first dance song. Social media exploded with photos of the bride in her designer gown and the groom looking younger than he had in decades. But amidst the celebration, Alexander caught glimpses of judgment in the eyes of his old friends. His college roommate, now a venture capitalist, pulled him aside during the reception. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" he asked, swirling his champagne. "I mean, she's gorgeous and smart, but she's closer in age to your hypothetical kids than to you." Alexander brushed off the concern with a laugh, but the words lingered. He noticed how his longtime business partners' wives would subtly distance themselves from Olivia at charity events, how conversations would stop when they entered rooms at social gatherings. Rose had disappeared completely from their shared social circles. Her absence was like a ghost that haunted the edges of his happiness. He'd heard through mutual friends that she'd moved to the East Coast, leaving behind the mansion and all its memories. Sometimes, late at night, he would find himself wondering if she was happy, if she found peace away from the world they'd built together. But Olivia had a way of chasing away his doubts. She brought color and excitement to every aspect of his life. She redesigned their penthouse with modern art and vibrant furnishings, filling the space with music and laughter. She hosted dinner parties where entrepreneurs mixed with artists, creating the kind of intellectual atmosphere he'd always craved but never knew how to cultivate. Their first year of marriage was a whirlwind of adventures. They explored ancient temples in Cambodia, went skydiving in Dubai, and danced at Carnival in Rio. Olivia documented everything on social media, building their image as the perfect power couple. Her following grew, and soon she was being invited to speak at conferences about digital marketing and personal branding. Alexander loved watching her grow into her own success. She launched a tech-focused lifestyle brand that quickly gained traction among millennials. The press praised her business acumen, and he felt proud that she was more than just the billionaire's young wife. But sometimes, in quiet moments when Olivia was busy with her phone or planning their next adventure, Alexander felt a strange emptiness. He couldn't quite name it. After all, this was exactly what he'd wanted. Freedom. Excitement. A life without boundaries or expectations. Then came the morning when he found his first gray hair since the divorce. It was such a small thing, but it sent him into a spiral of thoughts about time and age. Olivia was still in her prime, posting yoga poses on Instagram and getting recognized by fashion magazines. Meanwhile, he had to work twice as hard at the gym just to keep up with her energy. "You're being silly," she told him when he mentioned his concerns. "Age is just a number. Look at us, we're living proof that love doesn't care about birthdays." He wanted to believe her. Most days he did. But he couldn't help noticing how heads turned when she walked into rooms, how young executives at his company stumbled over their words around her. She was the sun, and sometimes he wondered if he was just another planet caught in her orbit. Their second year brought new challenges. Olivia wanted to travel more, to build her brand internationally. Alexander found himself increasingly tied to the office, dealing with a major product launch and potential acquisitions. The times they were together became more about photo opportunities than genuine connection. "We need to make an appearance at the Tech Innovation Gala," she'd say, or "This restaurant just opened, and my followers would love to see us there." He played along, smiling for cameras and making the right appearances. But sometimes, when he caught his reflection in the mirrors of their ultramodern apartment, he barely recognized himself. Was this really the freedom he'd been seeking? What he didn't know then was that life was about to throw him a curveball that would make his current doubts seem trivial in comparison. A revelation was coming that would force him to question not just his choices, but the very foundation of who he thought he was. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between board meeting updates and quarterly reports. Alexander almost missed it, just another message in his overcrowded inbox. But something about the subject line made him pause. "They have your eyes." Inside was a single photograph of 4 teenage boys standing outside Bay Area High School. They wore identical navy blue hoodies and carried backpacks, looking like any other group of students. Except they weren't just any students. Alexander's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, spilling across his desk. The boys were mirror images of each other, and of himself at 15. The same sharp jawline, the same slight tilt of the head when they smiled. Even the way one of them had his hands stuffed in his pockets was eerily familiar. It was like looking at an old photograph of himself multiplied by 4. "This has to be fake," he muttered, zooming in on their faces. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The resemblance was too perfect, too uncanny. His hands shook as he read the short message below the photo. "Time to meet your sons, Mr. Chen. They deserve to know their father." He cancelled his meetings for the day, claiming a family emergency. In a way, it was true. Hour after hour, he stared at the photo, trying to make sense of it. The boys looked about 15, which would mean they were conceived around the time. "Oh God," he whispered, suddenly remembering. Linda Wang. She'd been one of his first employees at TechVision, a brilliant programmer who'd helped build their initial software. She'd left abruptly 17 years ago, citing personal reasons. He'd been too busy building his empire to question it further. Alexander's personal investigator called back within hours. "The boys' names are David, Daniel, Dylan, and Derek Wang," he reported. "They live with their mother, Linda Wang, in a modest house about 20 miles from your office. They're sophomores at Bay Area High, straight-A students, all of them. And Mr. Chen, there's more." The story that unfolded over the next few hours left Alexander struggling to breathe. Linda hadn't just been his employee, she'd been a surrogate for him and Rose. They'd tried for years to have children, but Rose couldn't carry to term. The IVF procedure was supposed to be their last hope. But before they could tell anyone about the pregnancy, he'd asked for the divorce. The paperwork shows Rose knew about the successful implantation, his investigator continued. She helped Linda disappear, set her up with a new life. They raised the boys together, away from the spotlight. Alexander sat in his dark office until midnight, his world tilting on its axis. 4 sons. He had 4 teenage sons he'd never known about. Sons who'd grown up watching his face on magazine covers, seeing news about their biological father's glamorous life while they lived in anonymity. When he finally got home, Olivia was hosting a dinner party for her social media influencer friends. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses hit him like a physical blow. "Honey, where have you been?" Olivia called out. "Come meet everyone. We're discussing a potential collaboration for my new lifestyle brand." He walked past the perfectly dressed guests, past his wife's concerned look, straight to their bedroom. The walls, covered in photos of their travels and achievements, suddenly felt like a museum of wasted time. While he'd been chasing youth and excitement, his actual youth, his children, had been growing up without him. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay awake, wondering about his sons. Did they play sports? Were they interested in technology like him? Did they hate him for not being there? The questions multiplied until his head ached. The next morning, he drove to Bay Area High School, parking across the street. The security guard gave him odd looks as he sat there, watching teenagers stream into the building. Then he saw them, 4 identical boys walking together, laughing about something on one of their phones. His heart clenched. They moved as a unit, obviously close, protecting each other from the world. One wore glasses, another had a slight scar above his eyebrow, but they were undeniably his sons. And he was a stranger to them. A text from Olivia lit up his phone. "Where are you? We have the charity gala tonight." He turned off his phone, continuing to watch as his sons disappeared into the school building. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing. He'd walked away from Rose, thinking he was just leaving a stale marriage. But he'd walked away from so much more, from the chance to be a father, from watching his children grow up, from the kind of love that couldn't be captured in Instagram posts or magazine spreads. An hour later, he was still sitting there when another car pulled up. A woman got out. Linda, though the years had changed her. She walked straight to his car and tapped on the window. "I wondered how long it would take you to find out," she said when he rolled down the window. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held years of protected pain. "They're good boys, Alexander. Better than we probably deserve." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Would it have changed your decision?" She looked at him steadily. "You were so eager to start your new life, to be free. Rose knew you'd never choose us over that freedom, so we chose for you." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so consumed with escaping what he saw as a trapped life, he'd never considered what he might be running from. Now, 17 years later, the consequences of his choices were staring him in the face, quite literally, in the form of 4 boys who shared his DNA, but not his name. "They know about you," Linda continued. "How could they not? Your face is everywhere. But they don't know they're yours. At least, not yet. That decision was going to be theirs to make when they turned 18. But someone else made it for all of us." Alexander gripped his steering wheel, knuckles white. "What do I do now?" Linda's laugh was soft but without humor. "That's not my decision to make. But whatever you decide, remember, they're not accessories to your life. They're not a chance for redemption or a way to ease your conscience. They're people with their own lives and feelings. If you want to be part of their world, you'll have to enter it on their terms, not yours." She turned to leave, then paused. "They have robotics club after school today. They built a machine that won the state championship last month. Just like their father, they say. Funny how DNA works, isn't it?" As she walked away, Alexander sat there, overwhelmed by the weight of possibilities and consequences. His perfectly curated new life was about to collide with a reality he'd never imagined, and he had no idea if he was ready for what would come next. Alexander spent the next week diving deep into the past he tried so hard to forget. His private investigator's report painted a picture that made his heart ache with every detail. The truth was more complex and beautiful than he could have imagined. It started 17 years ago, when Rose couldn't carry a child to term after their 3rd miscarriage. The doctors had suggested surrogacy, and Linda, then a brilliant young programmer at TechVision, had offered to help. She'd seen how the losses affected Rose, how each failed pregnancy dimmed the light in her eyes. "I found the medical records," Alexander told his lawyer, spreading papers across the mahogany desk. "The IVF procedure was scheduled for March 15th, exactly 2 weeks before I—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The lawyer picked up one of the documents. "According to this, they implanted multiple embryos to increase the chances of success. No one expected all 4 to take." The more Alexander discovered, the more his past actions haunted him. While he'd been planning his escape from what he saw as a suffocating marriage, Rose had been secretly visiting fertility clinics, hoping to give him the family she thought would make him happy. Security footage from his old office building showed Rose and Linda meeting late one evening, just days after he'd announced his intention to divorce. He watched the grainy video of the two women hugging, crying together in the empty parking garage. They hadn't just been employee and employer. They'd already become linked by the precious lives growing inside Linda. Rose made sure Linda had everything she needed, his investigator explained. She used part of her divorce settlement to buy them a house in a good school district, set up trust funds for the boys' education. She even helped Linda start a small tech consulting business so she could work from home during the pregnancy. The boys had grown up with two mothers, Linda, who carried them and gave them her last name, and Rose, who visited every weekend, attended every school play, and loved them as fiercely as if she'd given birth to them herself. They'd created their own family, away from the spotlight and scandal of Silicon Valley. Alexander found himself parked outside their house one evening, watching through the windows as the family he never knew went about their daily life. The boys sat around a dining table, presumably doing homework. Linda moved around the kitchen, and there was Rose, setting plates for dinner like she'd done at their mansion for 20 years. His phone buzzed with another message from Olivia. "The press is asking questions about why you've been missing events. We need to make a public appearance soon." He turned off his phone and continued watching. One of the boys, Dylan, he'd learned, was explaining something animated to his brothers, his hands moving in the exact same way Alexander's did during passionate speeches. Another, Daniel, pushed up his glasses just like Alexander did when he was deep in thought. The next day, he visited his old family doctor, the one who'd been there through all the failed pregnancies. Dr. Chen's office hadn't changed in 2 decades, still filled with the same motivational posters and outdated magazines. "I wondered when you'd show up," the doctor said, pulling out a thick file. "Rose made me promise not to tell you. She said you'd made your choice, and she wanted to protect the boys from becoming a media circus." The doctor explained how Rose had discovered the pregnancy just days before Alexander asked for the divorce. "She came to me crying, not knowing what to do. Linda was already carrying your children, but you were distracted." Alexander remembered those days with painful clarity. The secret lunches with Olivia, the late-night texts, the way he'd stopped really seeing Rose. While he'd been planning his new life, she'd been protecting the future of 4 innocent lives. The hardest part, Dr. Chen continued, was keeping it quiet. 4 identical quadruplets born to a surrogate. The press would have had a field day, especially given the timing of your divorce. Rose and Linda decided to move to a smaller town, somewhere the boys could have a normal life. Alexander learned how the two women had supported each other through the challenging pregnancy. How Rose had been there for every ultrasound, every kick, every milestone. How she'd helped Linda through months of bed rest when the doctors worried about complications. The boys were born on a quiet Tuesday morning, 4 perfect, identical babies who shared Alexander's DNA but would never know his embrace. Rose and Linda had named them together, choosing names that honored both their Chinese and American heritage. They wanted the boys to know their full story when they were old enough to understand. Dr. Chen said. They kept journals, photo albums, letters explaining everything. They were going to tell them on their 18th birthday. Back in his office, Alexander found himself looking at recent school photos of his sons. David, the oldest by 2 minutes, was captain of the robotics team. Daniel had won the state mathematics championship. Dylan wrote code for fun, just like Alexander had at his age. Derek was the quiet one, but his art had already won several awards. Their achievements filled a wall in Linda's home office, trophies, certificates, newspaper clippings. Many of them were in technologies Alexander's company had pioneered, though the boys had no idea they were following in their father's footsteps. Rose had kept every report card, every childhood drawing, every birthday photo in carefully organized albums. She'd been there for their first steps, first words, first day of school, all the moments Alexander had missed while chasing what he thought was happiness. We tried to give them the best of both worlds, Linda explained during their second meeting, this time at a quiet coffee shop. Rose taught them about their Chinese heritage, just like she did with you. I made sure they knew about technology and innovation, the things that drove you to build Tech Vision. The boys had grown up surrounded by love, protected from the media circus that had followed Alexander's divorce and remarriage. They'd built their own tight-knit world, 4 brothers who looked out for each other and 2 mothers who would do anything to keep them safe. As Alexander drove home that evening, the weight of missed opportunities pressed down on him. He'd spent years crafting the perfect image with Olivia, chasing excitement and youth, while his actual legacy, his sons, grew up just miles away, unknown and unloved by their own father. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd left Rose because he felt trapped, suffocated by routine. But she'd been the one living an extraordinary life, helping raise 4 remarkable boys in secret, creating a family built on love rather than obligation. Now, as the truth came to light, he had to face the consequences of his choices. The carefully constructed world he built with Olivia was about to change forever, and he had no idea if there was room in his sons' lives for a father who'd never known they existed. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon at Linda's house. Alexander arrived early, sitting in his car and watching other families walk by, parents with strollers, kids on bikes, normal people living normal lives. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Inside, the house was warm and lived in. Science fair projects competed for space with art supplies on the dining table. 4 identical backpacks hung by the door, each distinguished by different keychains. Family photos covered the walls, birthdays, holidays, school events, 15 years of memories he'd missed. "They'll be home from their robotics competition soon," Linda said, placing a cup of tea in front of him. Rose sat quietly in the corner, her presence both familiar and strange. Neither woman showed anger, just a cautious protectiveness. "How?" Alexander cleared his throat. "How did you tell them about me?" "We never lied," Rose answered. "They knew they were born through surrogacy. They knew their biological father was successful in tech. We just didn't tell them it was you." The sound of laughter from outside made them all freeze. 4 teenage boys burst through the door, talking excitedly about their competition victory. They stopped dead when they saw Alexander. The silence was deafening. Alexander stared at his sons, seeing himself reflected 4 times over. David, the natural leader, stepped slightly in front of his brothers. Daniel nervously adjusted his glasses. Dylan's hands were stuffed in his pockets, just like Alexander did when nervous. Derek gripped his sketchbook tighter. "Boys," Linda said softly, "this is Alexander Chen, your biological father." The words hung in the air like smoke. Alexander wanted to speak, but what could he possibly say? "Sorry, I didn't know you existed. Sorry, I was too busy chasing my own happiness to be there for your first steps, first words, first everything." "We know who you are," David finally said, his voice steady but cold. "We've seen you everywhere. Tech magazines, news shows, social media. Always with your new wife, living your best life. While Mom, both our moms, worked so hard to give us a normal life," Dylan added. "We had to be careful not to stand out too much, not to draw attention. Do you know how hard that is when you're identical quadruplets?" Alexander felt each word like a physical blow. "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I had." "If you had known what?" Daniel interrupted. "Would you have stayed with Mom Rose? Would you have helped raise us? Or would we have just been a PR problem for your perfect new life?" The boys had moved to stand near their mothers, a united front against him. Their anger was justified, their hurt palpable. These weren't little kids who could be won over with toys or trips to Disneyland. They were thoughtful, intelligent young men who had spent years watching their biological father from afar. "We saw the interview you did last year," Derek spoke up, his quiet voice carrying weight. "The one where you said you never wanted kids because they would have held you back from becoming who you are today. That was fun to watch during lunch at school." Alexander remembered that interview. He'd been trying to justify his choices, defend his decision to leave his stifling marriage. He'd had no idea his own sons were out there, hearing his words, feeling their sting. "Your company's coding competition last spring?" David continued. "We won first place. We were supposed to meet the CEO, you, but you sent your VP instead. Were you too busy with your yacht party in Monaco?" The photos from that party were still on Olivia's Instagram. He'd been celebrating their anniversary while his sons were winning awards using the programming skills they'd inherited from him. "I'm not here to make excuses," Alexander said carefully. What I did, leaving Rose, not knowing about you, it was wrong. I was selfish. I thought I knew what happiness looked like. And now? Dylan challenged. Now that your perfect new wife is probably going to leave when she finds out about your secret teenage stunts. Now that your carefully crafted image is about to shatter. As if on cue, Alexander's phone buzzed. Another message from Olivia. The press is asking questions about why you've been visiting that house in the suburbs. Call me now. The boys watched him silence the phone, their expressions a mix of hurt and contempt. They'd grown up seeing their father's face everywhere, but never knowing his love. They'd achieved amazing things, not because of him, but in spite of his absence. We don't need you, David said firmly. We have two amazing moms who've given us everything. Love, support, understanding. Things you wouldn't know about because you were too busy chasing whatever midlife crisis brought you to abandon Mom Rose. Linda stepped forward. Boys, go upstairs, please. We need to talk to Alexander alone. They hesitated, years of protectiveness toward their mothers evident in their reluctance to leave. Finally, they headed upstairs, 4 sets of footsteps in perfect sync. They're good boys, Rose said once they were gone. Better than we probably deserve. They've dealt with being different, being a curiosity, but they've never let it define them. They've built their own identity, something you might want to think about. Alexander sat there, surrounded by the life he could have had. Photos of science fairs he'd missed, birthday parties he hadn't attended, quiet family dinners that had happened without him. His sons had grown up watching him live a glossy, superficial life while they built something real and meaningful. The press will find out soon, he said quietly. They always do. I need to. I should. You don't need to do anything, Linda interrupted. These boys are not your PR problem to solve. They're not your chance at redemption. They're people, amazing, brilliant, hurt people who have lived 15 years watching their biological father chase everything except them. The sound of quiet conversation drifted down from upstairs, 4 identical voices discussing the shattered reality of their world. Alexander realized with crushing clarity that he'd spent years building an empire, but these 4 boys, these strangers who shared his DNA, they were his real legacy. And he had no idea how to even begin making things right. The media storm hit exactly as expected. Tech billionaires' secret quadruplets screamed the headlines. Paparazzi camped outside Linda's house, forcing the boys to miss school. Olivia filed for divorce within days, claiming betrayal of trust. Alexander's carefully constructed world crumbled like a house of cards. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about his public image. The boys need privacy, he told his PR team. Handle it however you need to, but protect them. That's all that matters now. He rented a small apartment near the boys' school, away from his luxury penthouse and the life he'd built with Olivia. Every morning, he'd sit in the local coffee shop, watching parents drop their kids off at school, wondering how many precious moments he'd missed chasing what he thought was happiness. The first real breakthrough came 2 months after the confrontation. David called him late one night. Derek's having trouble with his coding project, he said stiffly. Mom Linda mentioned you might be able to help. Alexander drove over immediately, trying to contain his hope. He found Derek at the dining room table, surrounded by papers covered in programming language. I can't figure out why it won't compile, Derek mumbled, not meeting his eyes. For the next 2 hours, they worked together in near silence, father and son connected by lines of code. When they finally solved the problem, Derek's small smile felt like a victory worth more than any business deal. Slowly, cautiously, more moments followed. Daniel needed help preparing for a mathematics competition. Dylan wanted advice on a tech startup idea he was developing. David reluctantly accepted Alexander's offer to use TechVision's labs for the robotics team's practice. They're not forgiving you, Linda warned one evening. They're just giving you a chance to show who you really are. Alexander learned to listen more than he spoke. He discovered that David wanted to revolutionize renewable energy technology. Daniel dreamed of solving complex mathematical theorems. Dylan had already designed 3 apps. Derek expressed his feelings through digital art that took Alexander's breath away. The boys had inherited more than just his looks. They had his drive, his creativity, his passion for innovation. But they'd also inherited something better from their mothers, the ability to care deeply, to support each other, to value love over ambition. Rose's presence was harder to navigate. She'd created a foundation supporting single mothers and surrogates, with Linda as its director. The work they'd done had helped hundreds of families. "You chose excitement over stability," Rose told him during a rare moment alone. But sometimes the most exciting things in life are the quiet moments, watching your child finally solve a problem, seeing them support each other, being there for the small victories. 6 months after the revelation, Alexander made the biggest decision of his life. He stepped down as CEO of TechVision, shocking the business world. "I spent 20 years building a company," he announced in a press conference. "Now it's time to build something more important: relationships with my children." He took a position as a technical advisor instead, working part-time. His new schedule allowed him to attend the boys' robotics competitions, help with homework, and slowly, painfully, earn a place in their lives. The first time they invited him to dinner without being prompted by their mothers, he almost cried. They talked about school, their projects, their dreams. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. "Why did you really leave Mom, Rose?" Dylan asked one evening, after the others had gone upstairs. Alexander considered his answer carefully. "I thought I was trapped in a predictable life. I wanted excitement, adventure. I didn't realize that the biggest adventure is watching your children grow, seeing them become who they're meant to be. I was looking for happiness in all the wrong places." The boys graduated high school with top honors. All 4 were accepted into prestigious universities, their achievements making headlines that had nothing to do with their famous father. At the graduation ceremony, Alexander sat between Linda and Rose, watching his sons receive their diplomas. David's valedictorian speech talked about the strength found in unexpected families. Daniel wore his favorite coding competition medal under his gown. Dylan had already landed a summer internship at a major tech company, not TechVision. He'd been clear about wanting to make it on his own. Derek's art was being featured in a youth technology exhibition. "They're amazing," Alexander whispered, fighting tears. "They are," Rose agreed. "Not because of us, but because they had each other. And 2 mothers who would do anything for them." The real moment of healing came during the graduation party. The boys had insisted on a small celebration at home, just family. Alexander helped Linda set up decorations while Rose prepared their favorite foods. "Dad," David called out, making Alexander freeze. It was the first time any of them had called him that. "We need help with the video setup." He spent the next hour connecting cables and adjusting speakers, working alongside his sons as if they'd been doing it together for years. The easy conversation, the shared jokes, the comfortable silence. It was worth more than all his billions. Later that night, Derek showed him a digital art piece he'd been working on. It showed 5 figures, 4 teenage boys and an older man, their faces half in shadow, half in light. The title was simply Time. "It's about choices," Derek explained quietly, "and how it's never too late to make different ones." Alexander looked at his youngest son, younger by just 8 minutes, and saw wisdom beyond his years. "I'm sorry it took me so long to make the right choice." "We know," Derek replied. "But you're here now." The boys left for college in the fall, each pursuing their own dreams while remaining fiercely connected to each other. Alexander kept his small apartment, a reminder of what really mattered. His old life of luxury and constant travel seemed like a distant dream. One evening, he found a photo album on his doorstep. Inside were pictures of the boys growing up, birthdays, holidays, first days of school. Rose and Linda had documented everything. On the last page was a recent photo of all of them together, 4 boys, 2 mothers, and 1 father who'd finally found his way home. The note attached read, "Better late than never. Love, your family." Alexander Chen, once known for his billions and his young wife, was now known for something far more valuable: 4 remarkable sons who had taught him the true meaning of success. His greatest achievement wasn't the tech empire he built, but the relationships he was still building, one small moment at a time. The adventure he'd been seeking all along had been right there, waiting to be discovered in the quiet moments between a father and his sons.